Hey guys, Spudknocker here, as always, and today we're going to take a look at a topic that I have been asked about in countless pings, comments, and DMs since the release of DCS World 2.7. How do I make DCS World look so beautiful? What are your graphics settings? What hardware is in your battle station? Or some variation of those basic questions. 2 years ago now, I made a video called DCS World Breathtaking Graphics Tutorial, and I figured it was definitely time to make an updated version for 2.7 now that so much has changed and yet so little has changed very much for the better. A lot of people tend to think that I heavily post-process my video footage or have some sort of filtering program on my PC, such as Reshade, that adds the awesome depth and punchiness to the colors in my videos. This really couldn't be further from the truth, as my footage is all 100% stock DCS World footage that has been unaltered and unedited. One of my biggest goals of my channel is to show our viewers what is possible within the framework of DCS World and how to get the absolute most out of this amazing piece of software with no mods, changes, or additions to the base piece of software. I know that many DCS World pilots are understandably very frustrated by the graphics of DCS World when they first hop in and try out their first training mission, when the promotional videos put together by Eagle Dynamics are always absolutely gorgeous. This is unfortunately not an issue limited to DCS, but is true of the entire gaming industry, who have teams of professionals who put together stunningly fantastic trailers to advertise their games. However, we are extremely lucky that unlike mainstream AAA titles that must be compressed down to remain functional on the vast majority of PC components and consoles on the market, DCS World has all of the tools you need to make DCS look just as beautiful as Eagle Dynamics trailers due to the flexibility inherent in the way flight simulators are built, the vast amount of graphics settings, along with the many cinematic tools built right into DCS World itself. And yes, I know I have a rather high-end PC, but it is no longer the absolute bleeding edge thanks to the massive shortages in computer components we are all seeing lately. But many of the tips and tricks, as well as settings tweaks that we will go over today, apply to mid-tier and lower-end systems as well to transform your DCS World experience. The first thing we will do is take a look at some settings within DCS World that will definitely influence your graphical experience, then take a look at my Nvidia control panel, and finally finishing off with a look at the mission editor. I still firmly believe that 99% of improving your graphics in DCS is a function of the mission editor, and is something that every DCS World pilot, regardless of your PC, can influence very easily. Of course, you want to adjust the settings that I recommend to suit your own PC, your own style, and your own needs. This is a real game of trial and error, and some DCS pilots will prefer visual fidelity over frames per second, and vice versa. I personally fall into the former more than the latter due to my use of an Nvidia G-Sync monitor, which means that I am okay with a lower frame rate for increased graphical fidelity in this game that I love so much. Okay guys, we're now going to go through the first part of our breathtaking graphics tutorial for DCS World 2.7. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to come up to the top left of our main menu screen and click on the little gear icon to bring us to the settings page. We're now going to stay on the System tab to access all of the graphical and system settings for your DCS World install, save for one graphical setting that is actually buried in the Gameplay tab over here to the middle left. We're going to go over that setting at the end of this part, so we will make sure that we hit that one as well. My goal here is to give you guys as much knowledge as possible to back up your decisions when it comes to manipulating these settings to match and work out for your system you have at home. Now, I have a very high-end PC, and so a lot of these settings are going to be very similar to the video I made almost 2 years ago now, but it's definitely worth rehashing and taking another look at those settings and then trying to update those settings here for DCS World 2.7. Now the first two settings we're going to take a look at and talk about here are the textures and terrain textures up here in the top left column. We want to have these textures set to as high of a quality as possible. The textures up here in the very top are going to be affecting all of the things that you see that are not on the ground. So this is going to be your cockpit, your jet's fuselage, wings, tail, your weapons that are on your jet, the body of your helicopter cockpit, vehicles on the ground, weapons flying through the air, all of these kinds of things that we look at very, very often in DCS World. We want to try and have this texture setting at the highest possible setting, and most PCs are definitely going to be able to handle having these textures set to high. There is a small caveat to that, is if you have a lower end system and you are trying to fly the F-14 Tomcat, I highly recommend that you set these to medium or low. Now, if you have a lower end PC, I recommend setting to terrain textures to low before you reduce the fidelity of your main textures setting as well. It's better to have a nicer looking cockpit and a nicer looking jet than it is to have a nicer looking terrain over which you are flying, in my humble opinion. So we'll go ahead and set these back to high. For civilian traffic, I personally set these to off. In my opinion, as a specialist of flying fighter jets up high and very fast, I don't really get anything out of seeing cars traveling along roads down below, and I always force this option to off when I make multiplayer missions to try and save the myriad of different systems that are going to be playing in the mission some frames as well. If you're a helicopter pilot, you may want to have this turned on to high or medium, so that way you have plenty of life on those roads that you're skimming over down below. Water. I always like to have this set to high, especially if you're a carrier pilot. You're gonna want the water setting to the highest possible setting that your system can handle, due to your always being around the water and very close to the water when it comes to taking off and landing on the jet, and even just taxiing around the carrier itself. For visible range, this one is very much going to depend on your system. This is actually the range at which things start to render out in front of your jet or out in front of your helicopter, and it really, really influences the hit that your GPU and CPU get as well. For me, I found that my sweet spot is in the ultra section. If I do need a couple more frames for, say, a larger mission or a mission that's a bit more complex, I may drop that down to high as well. But I typically like to have that on ultra, as it gives me a very far horizon as I'm flying around, and it just looks really nice for me. Heat blur, of course, is the heat blur effect that comes out of, say, the tailpipe of a jet or the exhaust manifolds of a prop job, a World War II airplane. And so for me, I like to have this on low because the difference in visual fidelity, at least for me and my tastes, does not seem to warrant having this on high. As a result, I like to save some frames by keeping that on the low setting because it really doesn't look all that different to me personally. Shadows. There are a couple different shadow settings here in the system settings for DCS World, and for this one counts for shadows that are going to be inside of your cockpit. So inside your jet cockpit, your helicopter cockpit, or your warbird cockpit. We want to have those shadows set to as high of a setting as possible because, again, this is something that we're going to be looking at constantly, all the time, right in front of our face in the cockpit of our aircraft. Resolution, of course, this is going to depend on the resolution of the screen that you are using. I have an ultra-wide G-Sync monitor, and so of course I set this to the native resolution of the monitor. The aspect ratio, of course, is going to be also set by your resolution, and you really don't want to mess with that too much. Monitors, I just play with one screen, and that works out for me. You may have multiple and will have to change that setting accordingly. Resolution of cockpit displays. This actually changes the resolution at which your cockpit displays, like your MFDs, your MPCDs, your DDIs, and your various modern jets are displayed. I set this to 1024. I do not set it to 1024 every frame because if DCS World tries to downscale those cockpit displays in order to increase performance when I'm, say, looking at a target through a targeting pod, I like to make sure that it can do that. I don't like to force it to stay at 1024 all the time. If you have a lower end system, I definitely recommend trying to scale this back to a point where it's still tolerable for you and still looks nice, but still gives you the performance that you are seeking. MSAA is, of course, anti-aliasing. For me, I like to have this on 2 times, and of course, this also applies to super sample anti-aliasing down here as well. Personally, I believe that SSAA definitely looks a lot nicer than MSAA. However, in DCS World, SSAA makes the cockpit mirrors look atrocious, in my opinion, especially the mirrors in the F-14 Tomcat. It gets very, very pixelated and very odd looking, and as a result, turning on MSAA on top of the SSAA turns the pixelation of those mirrors into a nice, smooth looking view, which is of course very important for me because I like to have those mirrors on, especially in the F-14, because we can see the pilot moving around very naturally, and it's very, very cool. Depth of field, I always have that off. This tends to be a big GPU hit as well, so I always set that to off because I don't even like the way it looks anyway, and we can save some frames there. Your mileage may vary depending on what you like. Lens effects, this is not very high stress on your machine, and so you can set this to whatever you like, whether you want none, dirt, flare, or dirt and flare. I like the lens flare. It tends to give things a little bit more of a cinematic look, and it's kind of cool. And I like the way it looks in videos and tutorial videos, things of that nature. Motion blur, I absolutely cannot stand motion blur, but your mileage may vary. I do not believe that this has much of an effect on FPS. I do know that some people swear by it, and some people can't stand it. I guess I fall in the latter category there. Clouds. This is another setting that is very new to DCS World 2.7, and because the load that is placed on your system by the new clouds is mostly GPU based, 99% of DCS World players are going to be able to set the clouds to ultra, especially if you're playing on a 2D screen and not in VR. The reason being is DCS World does not really tax your graphics card very heavily at all, and so adding just a little bit more load to your graphics card is not going to tax your system all that heavily. I highly recommend at least trying to put your clouds on Ultra, and if you need to change it from there, go ahead and do so. Super sample anti-aliasing, we already talked about that. That's where your system actually renders the scene in front of you at a higher resolution than is actually displayed on your screen. It then downscales that picture to then be pumped to your screen and uses that downscaling to actually smooth out a lot of those jaggies. SSAA is a massive tax on your system and should definitely be used sparingly. For me, I find that SSAA at 1.5 and MSAA at 2 times definitely makes DCS World look the absolute best I possibly can. If I need to increase my frames just a little bit and try to squeeze out a little bit more performance, I'll drop SSAA down to 0 and I will turn up MSAA to 4 times. With the combination of both SSAA and MSAA, I tend to reduce a lot of the shimmering effects that we see on things like airfield fences or faraway aircraft edges, canopies that are also far away on different jets who maybe are flying in formation with you. Things like that used to absolutely drive me nuts before SSAA was added as an option within DCS World. Now, screen space lighting reflections, SSLR, and screen space ambient occlusion are 2 new additions to the system settings of DCS World, and they are massive, massive penalties to your FPS on your system. And for me, personally, I don't even notice a real difference in my graphical fidelity in DCS World with these turned on or off. But each setting tends to reduce my FPS by about 20 frames off of my already standard 65 to 80 frames that I get with my current anti-aliasing settings. So it's absolutely untenable for me to have these turned on. And like I said, I cannot even see a difference when they are turned on at all. We're going to go up to these sliders up in the top right here. Clutter and grass. These are of course showing you how far away you're going to see things like grass and clutter on the taxiways, or way down low when you're flying a helicopter right across the ground. And I like to have this up to the highest point so that way I can see all the cool little details that are added to the dirt alongside the taxiways as I'm taxiing to runway to take off for my mission. It really adds to the quality of my videos in my opinion, and so it's a very important thing to do. The next setting is preload radius. This is the radius of the terrain around your aircraft when you first spawn in that is preloaded into your system's memory. This setting directly affects how long it takes to load yourself into a mission and get going. It especially affects how long it takes to join a multiplayer server. Right now, if you have not done so already, go ahead and go into your system settings in your options and cut this value that you already have in half. And you'll see that it takes a lot less time to join, especially a multiplayer server and a single player mission as well. If you have a high-speed SSD in your system, this preload radius really does not need to be all that high, and you will still have your textures and the terrain information loaded into your memory from your high-speed SSD very, very quickly. You may notice more quick little stutters as you're flying through a mission if your preload radius is a little bit smaller, but we have to balance out how long we're willing to wait to load into a multiplayer server and how much stuttering we want to see as we're flying through a mission as we reach the edge of this radius and the new terrain information has to be streamed in from our SSD. If you have a hard drive, I highly recommend upgrading to an SSD to play DCS World. It is a game that is highly dependent on information being taken from your hard drive and put directly into the memory, such as the terrain around you. If you are going to be playing on a hard drive and can't not actually upgrade that very soon, you want to have a higher preload radius so that way you reach the edge of that radius around your aircraft in longer intervals. Chimney smoke density, I don't really see much of a difference with this, especially because I don't fly on many of the World War II maps, so I tend to leave chimney smoke density at 1. I don't really like to degrade my frames by having a ton of chimney smoke coming out of houses. For me, that doesn't really add up to all that much of an increase in the visual fidelity of the simulator itself. When it comes to gamma, this is a big setting that does not affect FPS, but rather affects just the look of the game itself, that a lot of people tend to have too high, in my opinion. A lot of people have this set to the default setting of like around 2.2, and I like to drop this all the way down to 1.6. It increases the saturation, it increases the contrast of the colors in my DCS World install by many factors, and just makes things look a lot more punchier and have a lot more depth to them than when you have that gamma cranked way up high. You can also adjust this setting on the fly in your missions as you're flying, so as light conditions change, you can open up your options and adjust your gamma to suit how you like it to look best as those lighting conditions change as you fly through your mission. Azeotropic filtering, go ahead and set that to 16 times even if you have a lower end system. This does not affect FPS at all. Terrain objects shadows, if you have a lower end system, definitely try having it on flat before you turn it all the way off. Having it on default is of course the best, and having shadows that look really nice on the terrain that are cast by trees, mountains, buildings, etc. are just going to give the terrain a lot more depth and give you a very much increased sense of altitude as well as scale as you're looking at things on the ground. Cockpit global illumination. This is up to you whether you want to have your cockpit lit up a little bit more even when you're in, say, a shadow underneath one of the brand new and gorgeous clouds here in 2.7, or you're in a lower light setting as well. Rain droplets is of course a very important setting that definitely does eat away at your FPS if you have a lower end system. But it is a setting that DCS World players wanted really bad, and Eagle Dynamics of course gave it to them to very much applause from the DCS World community. VSync, definitely have that turned on if you have a lower end monitor in which you don't have the ability to have adjustable frame rate like a G-Sync kind of system or a FreeSync kind of system. And of course, if you are running at lower FPS, you may want to cap your actual frames of the game at a lower setting, so that way you don't have quite so much variance from your high end to your low end of your FPS as you're playing through a game. For me, with G-Sync, which I think is absolutely necessary in 2021 when playing any game, not just DCS World, that variable refresh rate just makes those highs and lows just kind of merge together, and you really don't notice changes or disparities in FPS at all. Full screen, this is a setting that now actually does something within DCS World. If you have this checked and you try to say Alt-Tab to another window, like say my Nvidia control panel, you are not going to be able to get there and have that window overlaid over the top of DCS World. DCS World will collapse, and so this is going to be a setting that you definitely want to have unchecked in DCS World 2.7, at least right off the bat here, because a lot of DCS World players, including myself and all of those that I fly with, are always alt-tabbing out to other programs such as SRS, or Chrome or Edge to take a look at shared mission briefing files, or PDFs that a mission briefing is in to get valuable information that we need on the fly as we're flying through the mission. Okay guys, we're now going to go through part 2 of our breathtaking graphics tutorial for DCS World 2.7. In this part, we're going to take a look at the Nvidia control panel and how we can manipulate those settings to get the best looking and best performing DCS World install we possibly can. So let's go ahead and Alt-Tab over to our Nvidia control panel. And through many hours of testing and tweaking and playing with things to try to get the best looking and best performing DCS World install possible, I have hit on the fact that we want to have DCS World and its code in control of the graphics as much as possible with as little interference from the Nvidia control panel as possible. As a result, almost all of my settings within the Nvidia control panel are set to off or set to application controlled as a result. Due to this part of this video might be a little bit boring and might not have any brain-exploding revelations for you guys watching. However, it is a very important part of making DCS look absolutely great. Everything in the top here, ambient occlusion, FXAA, gamma correction, all turned off, anti-aliasing transparency turned off. That was a big one to reducing a lot of the awful shimmering of things like fences at airfields. Background application max frame rate, that's turned off. CUDA core GPUs, that's turned on. That's better for productivity like video editing. And then anisotropic filtering and anti-aliasing mode, that's definitely set to application controlled. These are two massive settings that we definitely want DCS World to be in 100% control of. So that's why we have those set to application controlled. The anti-aliasing, when set to DCS controlling it, looks so much better than when we have Nvidia control panel interfering with the anti-aliasing that is coded into DCS World itself. DSR factors, unnecessary, that's turned off. Low latency mode, that's turned off. Max frame rate, I definitely want that turned off because I have a G-Sync monitor, so I want DCS World to push up to the maximum frames possible, and because I have the buffer of G-Sync that makes the lowest frame rates all the way to the highest frame rates look the same, I don't really mind at all. MFAA, so multi-frame sampled anti-aliasing, definitely turned off. That's going to make DCS World not look very great. Power management mode, of course, we're going to prefer maximum performance. Even if my electric bill goes up, I don't really care. Got to make awesome videos for you guys. Shader cache, we're going to have that on because that helps the GPU actually cache a bunch of shaders, and I actually do find that does help performance in DCS. Texture filtering, anisotropic sample optimization, definitely off. That's going to negatively affect DCS World because it's not really in control of that. Negative LOD bias, we're going to clamp that to as little as possible. Texture filtering quality, definitely set that to performance. We want to have the best performance possible, and that keeps the Nvidia control panel with not interfering with texture filtering that's already in DCS. Trilinear optimization, I have that set to on. Threaded optimization also set to auto. Triple buffering, that is off. That negatively affects performance in DCS World. Vertical sync, definitely use 3D application setting. We have that turned off in DCS World, of course, but if those are out of sync with each other, like say you have it turned on in the Nvidia control panel and off in DCS World, and you're not understanding why your frames are capped at a certain spot, you may want to check to make sure that these are in sync and they are working together rather than against each other. Virtual reality pre-rendered frames set to 1 because I don't want it pre-rendering frames. Don't even have VR turned on at the moment. And variable super sampling, that's definitely off because I'm not using VR at the moment as well. So like I said, this section is a little bit boring, and like just kind of recapping, we want to have DCS World in 100% control of all of the graphical settings and rendering from your graphics card, rather than having the Nvidia control panel interjecting and interfering with DCS World. Believe me, I have done so much testing on this that this is the best possible solution. So let's go ahead and move on to part 3, taking a look at the mission editor and how we can make our missions look absolutely fantastic. Welcome to part 3 of the Breathtaking graphics tutorial for DCS World 2.7. And as we look around here, we can see that DCS World looks flat, boring, and uninteresting, with no depth, no sense of altitude, and really not much of a sense of speed to speak of. The details of the terrain are muted. The mountains look flat and uninteresting. And if we look at our wingmen, or head out to the F2 view, we can see that the normally gorgeous detailing of the F-14 Tomcat is very muted and unappealing. It's hard to see all those amazing details that Heatblur put so much work into. And unfortunately, this is the view of DCS World and its graphics in a very unoptimized fashion that new DCS World players are greeted with the first time they load up DCS World, because most of, if not all, training missions in DCS World are loaded in at 12 noon in June, where the sun is directly overhead. And so I can't tell you how many new DCS World pilots I've flown with that are completely shocked by just the increase in graphical fidelity of DCS World by just making a few tweaks to your missions in the DCS World mission editor. And if you download a mission that you really want to play but can't stand the lack of weather and lack of interesting variation on the terrain, you can always open up that mission in the mission editor and make these same tweaks that we're going to go over right now together. So let's go ahead and close this mission, open up the mission editor, and show you guys how we can make this mission pop. Okay guys, here we are in the mission editor, and we're going to go ahead and increase the visual fidelity of the mission that we just flew to make it pop and look a lot more visually interesting without even touching any of the system settings that we took a look at earlier. As a result, all of these tips are going to apply to someone with a super high-end system on one end of the spectrum, all the way to someone with a super low-end system on the other side of that spectrum. So let's go ahead and zoom in a little bit, and we can see our flight of 2 F-14 Tomcats flying southwest through the Bekaa Valley down towards Israel in the south. So we're going to go ahead and open up the weather tab over here under the MIS section, and it's the second tab down, date, time, and weather via the tooltip. We can see that this mission was flown in June at 12 noon. This is literally the worst time of year and time of day that we could possibly have in a DCS World mission. As a result, the sun is going across the sky directly overhead because it's June, and it's 12 noon, so the sun is literally directly overhead. The sun's not casting any shadows, there's no relief on the terrain, there's no shadowing from the bump map on the skin of the F-14 Tomcat. Things just look blah, boring, and just kind of gross. However, that's not to say that it's not necessarily realistic. If you've ever flown at 12 noon over the Southern California desert in June, you can see just how realistic this lighting effect actually is when Southern California just looks absolutely awful at that time of day with the same issues. No shadowing on the terrain, no shadows on the skin of your aircraft, all these kinds of things that roll in to make DCS World look great and make a really nice picture for, say, a photographer in real life as well. So first thing we're going to do here is we're going to change our time of year to, say, September, when the sun is not necessarily going to be going across the sky directly overhead. We're also going to change the time of day, let's say 0700 in the morning, so that way we're going to have the sun low in the sky casting nice long shadows across the ground, through the clouds, and of course onto the skin of our aircraft as well to really show off the awesome detailing on a jet like the F-14 Tomcat. Now, if we just hopped into the mission right now without any clouds at all, this mission would already look a lot nicer as a result. However, we're also going to go ahead and make sure we add some clouds. So let's go ahead and instead of making a full overcast layer like we've seen in the intro to this video quite a bit, why don't we go for scattered 6 here, why not? We'll hit OK, and we'll bring the base all the way down to 10,000 feet, which is going to be below the level of the aircraft that we're flying at an altitude of 15,000 feet MSL for the start of the mission. We'll go ahead and hit save, and we'll go ahead and fly the mission and show you guys just how much nicer this is going to look with just that very simple tweak that we just did in the DCS World mission editor. We'll go ahead and throw the autopilot on, and wow, what a stunning difference. It literally took 10 seconds,
1 mile.
And things are looking so much better. The world looks interesting. We get a very good sense of speed from these clouds, these beautiful new DCS World 2.7 clouds. And if we look into the F2 view, we can see the sun low on the horizon is casting amazing shadows across the skin of our F-14 Tomcat. And things just look so much better. I really hope that those who are making modules for DCS World take a note of this and update their training missions to make sure that they take advantage of all of the options and effects in the mission editor to make training missions really pop and look really nice for those whose first experience in DCS World is always opening up a training mission. Like I said, I can't tell you how many new DCS World pilots, when they first fly with me and see different weather options, their minds explode and they see, wow, this is what I saw in the trailers and that is what brought me to DCS World, not just flat, featureless terrain from 12 noon in June. So I hope you guys really enjoyed this video, and I really hope you guys learned something from this video, and I really hope that it increases your enjoyment of DCS World, because that is the whole reason why that I create videos in DCS World, because it's an awesome, inspirational, and aspirational product that I really want people to get the absolute most out of. So please give us a like and a subscribe. Of course, fly safe out there and stay healthy as always, guys. We will see ya in the next one.